wanted to start out with just some talk about my perspective and some of the language I'll be using. It's important just to point out that my perspective has been shaped by my experiences as a parent of 2 children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and also that our research is guided and informed by the families that participate in our research studies, and you'll hear an example of that today. And I tend to use person-first language because that's what most of our families in our studies tend to prefer. So I wanted to start out just by talking about kind of an overview of the kind of research I do. I've been studying brain development since 1990s, and my goal is really to understand how early life events and things that could potentially be modified could lead to later changes in neurodevelopment and also resulting neurodevelopmental conditions. I've been primarily focused on autism spectrum disorders and more recently ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And also as an epidemiologist and a molecular epidemiologist, I'm really focused on learning more about some of the biologic mechanisms that could be playing roles in between the path to leading to some of these different trajectories of development. And today I'm going to focus on one particular exposure that could happen early in life. And I'm going to talk about, because it's fairly relevant as we start to go into the wildfire risk period. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wildfire smoke. Most of my work has also come out of the MARBLE studies, as has been mentioned. That's the Markers of Autism Risk in Babies, Learning Early Signs. That's what the full MARBLE's acronym stands for. As mentioned, this was a study started way back in 2006, where we enroll families that have a child with autism already, and then the mom is pregnant with a new child, and so we follow that pregnancy and that child until they're older, and we assess them for various neurodevelopmental outcomes, including autism. And we do that in the Mind Institute Clinic using gold standard methods. And these younger siblings of children with autism are at much higher risk for developing autism themselves. It's about 7 times the risk of the general population, at about 1 in 5 or 20%, compared to 1 in 31, the going rate in the general population. And so you might remember back in 2017, in the Napa, Sonoma, we had large wildfires that burned neighborhoods. And so this was one of the most devastating wildfires at that time. And then it was followed in 2018 by the Camp Fire, which then became one of the most devastating fires in Northern California history. So several of the largest and most destructive fires have happened in the last several years, and these have produced some of the highest particulate matter concentrations ever recorded. But the other concerning factor is that they're hitting these urban areas, which is not only a concern for lives lost and property loss, but also in terms of what's going into the smoke. Because when these wildfires hit these areas, now they're burning things like cars and melting refrigerators and burning building materials and things that release other chemicals into the smoke that might be of concern and travel far distances in the air. So when these wildfires broke out, these women in our MARBLE study who were pregnant were asking us at the time how concerned should they be about this wildfire smoke and how they should protect themselves and their developing baby. And at the time, we found out we didn't really know much about the impacts of wildfire smoke on pregnancy and children. And so we did know that during the period of early development, there's a lot of changes that are happening, and this is a period that's particularly vulnerable to various environmental exposures, including air pollution in general, like ambient air pollution from traffic and industry and other things. And there have been lots of studies linking air pollution in general during pregnancy to other birth outcomes like birth weight and gestational age or preterm birth. And there's also studies showing links between air pollution, high air pollution levels, and increased risk for other neurodevelopmental outcomes like autism and ADHD. But we didn't really know this for wildfire smoke particularly, and the components are a bit different, although some of them overlap. And so we decided, this might be worth investigating because there's a lot of reason to think that there could be some sort of effect of having the exposure to wildfire smoke during pregnancy on that developing child. We already knew that smoke exposure could lead to black carbon from the smoke getting to the fetal side of the placenta, so it's getting in there. And we also know that components that are found in wildfire smoke, like particulate matter, can trigger inflammatory damage, which can also influence placenta function. And so these were things already known from air pollution studies, so we would think that maybe wildfire would have similar effects. And then we also saw some studies came out from earlier wildfires showing that there were links between wildfire exposure and pregnancy and preterm birth and low birth weight. And so there were still questions, though, on who's most vulnerable, and whether those early developmental impacts could lead to longer-term impacts on child health outcomes, and also what mechanisms are going on in order to be able to kind of maybe reduce some of those effects. And so I've been very interested in just, how do these early life exposures make a difference for later, years later, the neurodevelopmental outcomes of some of these children. And this kind of leads me to the theory that's been around for a while now, showing that there are these developmental origins of health and disease, and adult disease at that. So we know that there's this time of kind of reprogramming that goes on using epigenetics. So epigenetics is, a lot of time we focus on DNA methylation, which is this little methyl group that's put on DNA, which helps, that's associated with gene expression. And so the important part of that isn't really that mechanism, but during early development, around the time of conception, so very early on, the whole methylome tends to be wiped out for that developing fetus and then reestablished, except for at certain imprinted genes that doesn't happen. And we think the reason for this is to kind of adapt that developing fetus for its outcoming environment. And so you can imagine that this is also a period that's really important for maybe environmental influences to make a big mark on how the resulting trajectory of that development and the gene expression that happens after that point. And so we did see evidence of some of this in macaque studies. So, when these wildfires happen, we're not the only ones exposed to the smoke. There's these macaque non-human primates that are sheltered outside, so they just live outdoors, and they're in the smoke more than we are, so keep that in mind, that they're exposed basically all day long. But there were monkeys that were pregnant, and then also ones that had young infants that were exposed to this smoke, and they saw in those infants that they later had influences on their respiratory health and their immune dysfunction, but also that there were changes in their methylome, or the epigenetic markers, that showed changes in their immune and nervous system genes in those pathways. And so that was actually when one of those researchers came to me and said, she was a respiratory researcher, and she's like, looks like there's something neurodevelopmental going on here. So we've collaborated now to kind of look more into this. But also those infants, as they followed them up, they developed a lot of behavioral and memory impairments. And so this was also a concern that maybe there's these longer term influences of that early life wildfire smoke exposure. And so with all of that, I started a new cohort. This was called the BSAFE, Biospecimen Assessment of Fire Effects, Wildfire Pregnancy Study. So these were all moms that had been pregnant during the time that these wildfires broke out. So starting with the 2017 Napa Sonoma fires, continuing through the 2018 Camp Fire, the 2019 Kincaid Fire, which was much smaller, the 2020 Complex Fires, and then 2021, we also had the Lightning Fire. So there were plenty of fires to follow up on, and over time we enrolled about 550 women. into the study, and then we followed their pregnancy outcomes and collected a lot of biological samples close to the time after the wildfires had occurred. And so in these moms, this is the areas where we pulled them from, mostly in the greater Sacramento region, where we could drive up to 2 hours because we drove to them to collect samples and information. And then the idea is now we're going to be hopefully bringing them all into the mine to assess their children. So this is just showing actually where they had lived at the time the fires broke out. And just a note that some of them evacuated during the fires or moved to other places to avoid the smoke. And those are shown here, but basically most of them stayed in Northern California. We collaborated with Sean Raffus and Mike Kleeman here at UC Davis, did some very fancy air pollution modeling for the wildfire smoke during each of these fires. And then this is just kind of giving you an idea of what the wildfire peaks look like across fires. So you can tell that November 2018 campfire was, again, like much larger than the 2017 fires in terms of concentrations of smoke and particulate matter that went into the air. It also covered all of Northern California. And then the complex fires in 2020 and 2021 look relatively small, but they lasted a lot longer. And down below, you can see what the actual fires look like. Above was what our participants experienced based on their address histories. And so we just recently did a pilot study where we went back to the 2017 and 2018 wildfire families, and we had the mothers complete questionnaires about their children and their behavior and their respiratory health. And the part I'll talk about now is just, these kids were around 4 years old at the time that the moms completed these questionnaires. She did a child behavior checklist, and we did about half males, half females, about 50 of each. And then we connected that with the particulate matter, PM 2.5, that the mom would have been exposed to during pregnancy, during the wildfire. And even though all of these moms were exposed to some level of smoke during the fires, there was a pretty good variant of more and less exposure. And what we saw in our findings was pretty concerning. We found that almost across all of the different scales of developmental problems on the child behavior checklist, that those who were exposed to higher PM 2.5 or smoke levels reported more problems on basically all of these different problem scales, including the one for autism and ADHD, internalizing and externalizing. So that was a big concern. And the other thing that was kind of interesting was that this was completely driven by the males. You can see that in the females shown there, when we split them apart, they really didn't show the same level of problems associated with the smoke. It was really driven by the males. The other thing that we noted was that we had only looked at those 2 wildfire years, and if we looked by year, which I'm not showing, but the 2018 campfire was really driving all of those associations as well, which was a much bigger year in terms of much higher concentrations of smoke. And so now we just got funded to bring all of these families in, or at least connect with them again. We hope to get more assessments on everybody. We also want to assess the females now that they're older, because we think that maybe there was some of the problems tend to show up later in girls, and so we might be missing something that might show up later. So now we're doing that work. We're also looking at a lot of our measures to look at kind of mechanisms, like whether there's inflammation and immune responses involved in maternal samples that were collected early on, and then also looking at epigenetic markers in the kids. And I did want to follow up with just that study is ongoing. It's really unique because we have a cohort with samples where we can look at kind of the mechanisms and also exposure levels and things like that. But on the flip side, that was the first study ever looking at this, so we wanted to kind of follow that up. So I have a study that's a statewide linkage study So much larger. Now we're talking all births in California across 2 decades. And we looked at their levels of wildfire smoke across all of that time, each family, each birth, and what they would have been exposed to during pregnancy. And we have done this, I'm presenting results that are a little early, preliminary, and just from 2010 through 2019. And you can see kind of the areas that were most affected by wildfire smoke there. And just to note that from this study, we also linked all those birth records and their air pollution at that time to later developmental conditions in the Department of Developmental Services data. And we saw that when we looked at autism spectrum disorders in particular, that this is again over 8.6 million records we're looking at, with over 70,000 cases of autism. And we see a similar association between higher wildfire smoke or particulate matter concentrations in the mom during pregnancy was linked to higher risk for the child later being diagnosed and treated for autism spectrum disorders. We did note that there was a threshold effect, so it was only if those concentrations got above a certain level. And then we also saw that these associations were more pronounced for families where they weren't previously exposed to air pollution at high levels. And so it's kind of the new introduction of this environmental exposure that seems to make a bigger impact. So again, we're really interested in looking at mechanisms which might be driving some of these things so we can learn how to mitigate some of these associations. And I've been really focused on placentas because they're a fascinating tissue that at birth we can collect, and it kind of serves as like a time capsule of what happened, gestational events that happened during pregnancy. And so we can use that to look at epigenetic markers that show gene pathways that might be influenced not only by the exposure, but then also that relate to later developmental outcomes. And I know this is a lot, but the takeaway is we looked at about 230 placentas, and this is now combining the MARBLES cohort study of high-risk autism families with the Be Safe pregnancy cohort, or where they're exposed to wildfires, kind of putting them all the placentas together, looking at pathways that overlap in terms of changes in methylation during pregnancy, that in relation to both the wildfire smoke exposure and later autism and other child behavior checklist problem behaviors in the child later. And we saw overlap in a couple different modules. And some of these implicated inflammatory response pathways. And interestingly, one of the strongest ones showed the biggest overlap was really implicating synaptic pathways. So you can see like neuronal specification and synapse organization, a lot of these terms for pathways that were both linked to both the exposure and the outcome. So this is work that we plan to follow up. I won't go into the national echo study, but just to let you know that there's also a national study of pregnancy. We have a site here. There's wildfire events that are happening during those pregnancies, and so we're also collecting samples and following those children up for many different outcomes beyond neurodevelopment, including obesity and other respiratory outcomes. I just want to mention there's also other ways we're looking into some of the mechanisms. We're also looking more into those macaque monkeys to look at their epigenetics, and then also exploring brain organoids, because we have collected wildfire smoke samples from all these wildfires, and so we can expose them to brain organoids and see what pathways are influenced. And then also, we use those samples for a lot of other things, looking at which exposures in that wildfire smoke in particular might be of concern. So for example, moms with the 2017 fires were really worried about heavy metals exposure. And so we collected hair and fingernail samples where we can kind of look at a timeline, especially in hair, before and during and after the wildfires, and you can kind of see a little peak there that happens to be 10, but we can kind of time it back and see what exposures that they were exposed to during that time of the fire, and then see if those are later implicated in some of these developmental outcomes. We're also working a lot with trying to get funding to do some intervention studies to put air purifiers in pregnant people's homes, and then also community education about using masks if they're outdoors and that kind of thing. So a lot of different directions. Also a lot of collaborators to recognize. I just want to recognize Amanda Goodrich, Carl Osharkey, and Logan Williams. Those are all people in our lab that have work that I have presented today, and then also a lot of funding sources and a great team. Some of my disclosures, and thank you for your attention.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with a promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.